Welcome back to Space for Sonder, and for those of us who haven't been here before, welcome. My name is Kira, and I will be your host. In today's episode, we're going to focus on men's mental health, a topic that is often spoken about during awareness campaigns, but still is deeply misunderstood in everyday life. Because while conversations around mental health have become more visible in recent years, there remains a significant gap when it comes to how men experience, express, and access support for their mental health, and that gap has consequences. Globally, men are significantly less likely to seek psychological support compared to women, yet they are disproportionately represented in suicide statistics. In the UK, data from organisations such as Office for National Statistics consistently shows that suicide rates are highest amongst men, particularly those in working age groups. This is not a marginal issue. It is one of the most urgent public mental health concerns we face. At the same time, research from organisations like Mind highlight that men are less likely to access talking therapies or seek early intervention, often presenting only when distress has become severe. So we are left with a contradiction. Men are struggling, but many are not accessing support until crisis point. This episode is not about blaming individuals. It is about understanding the cultural, psychological, and relational forces that shape how men are taught to relate to their emotions, and how those forces impact mental health across the lifespan. Before we begin, this episode includes discussions of men's mental health, emotional distress, suicide, and barriers to seeking support. While the conversation is handled carefully and reflectively, these themes may feel emotionally close to lived experiences for some listeners. You are encouraged to engage at your own pace, pause if needed, and prioritize your well-being throughout. If anything raised here feels difficult, support is available, and you do not have to navigate it alone. To understand men's mental health, we first need to understand how emotional expression is shaped long before adulthood. Mental health does not begin when distress appears. It develops across a lifetime of learning how to interpret, manage, and communicate emotion. One of the most influential frameworks for understanding this comes from gender role socialization theory, which suggests that behaviors and emotional patterns are learned through cultural expectations about gender. From an early age, many boys are exposed to explicit and implicit messages about what is considered acceptable emotional behavior. Emotions such as sadness, fear, or vulnerability are often discouraged, while traits such as toughness, control, and emotional restraint are reinforced. This process is not always direct. It can appear in subtle forms: how caregivers respond to distress, how peers react to emotional expression, or how media represents masculinity. Over time, these repeated experiences shape internalized beliefs about emotion and identity. Within this context, emotional suppression becomes not just a behavior, but a learned strategy. Psychological research suggests that emotional suppression, the conscious inhibition of emotional expression, is associated with increased psychological distress over time, including heightened anxiety and depressive symptoms. While suppression may reduce outward expression of emotion in the short term, it does not reduce the internal emotional experience. Instead, it often intensifies internal stress. This creates a tension that is central to men's mental health. On the surface, emotional control may be interpreted as strength. Internally, however, unprocessed emotional experience can accumulate, often without clear outlets for expression. This is where cultural expectations around masculinity become particularly significant. Sociological and psychological research has long highlighted the concept of hegemonic masculinity, a term used to describe dominant cultural ideals of what it means to be a man. These ideals often prioritize independence, emotional restraint, competitiveness, and resilience in the face of difficulty. While these traits are not inherently negative, they become problematic when they are positioned as the only acceptable way of being, because when emotional expression is discouraged, emotional processing becomes limited. Over time, this can lead to what researchers describe as emotional restriction, not the absence of emotion, but a reduced capacity to identify, articulate, or communicate emotional states. This is closely linked to alexithymia, a psychological construct characterized by difficulty in recognizing and describing emotions. Studies have found higher rates of alexithymic traits in populations where emotional expression is socially restricted, including within traditional masculine norms. In everyday life, this may not appear as lack of emotion. Instead, it often appears as something more ambiguous. Emotional distress may be expressed through irritability rather than sadness, through withdrawal rather than verbal disclosure, through overworking, substance use, or distraction rather than direct communication. And importantly, these are not random behaviours. They are adaptations, ways of managing internal experience within the limits of what feels socially or personally acceptable. This is where misunderstanding often occurs in relationships, because when emotional expression does not match expected forms, such as verbal communication or visible distress, it can be misinterpreted as absence of emotion altogether. But emotional absence is rarely the issue. More often, it is emotional containment, and containment has a cost, because what is not expressed is not resolved. It is stored, carried, and often intensified over time. So when we talk about men's mental health, we're not just talking about individual experiences of distress. We're talking about systems of learning, about what emotions are allowed and what emotions are discouraged, and what happens when expression is limited for long enough that it becomes unfamiliar. Building on the idea that emotional expression is often shaped and restricted from an early age, it becomes easier to understand why seeking help can feel so difficult for many men, even when distress is present. Help seeking is not simply a practical decision, it is a psychological and cultural one. It involves not only recognizing that support is needed, but also overcoming internalized beliefs about what it means to need support in the first place. Research consistently shows that men are significantly less likely to access mental health services compared to women, even when experiencing similar levels of distress. Reports from organizations such as Mind suggest that men often delay seeking help until symptoms become severe or crisis-driven. This delay is not usually due to a lack of awareness, but rather a combination of stigma, identity, and emotional conditioning. One of the key barriers is what is often described as self-stigma, the internalization of negative beliefs about mental health. When someone grows up in environments where vulnerability is associated with weakness, dependence, or failure, these associations do not simply disappear in adulthood. Instead, they can become internalized frameworks that shape behavior long after the original context has changed. Within this framework, seeking help can feel like a threat to identity. It can create a sense of contradiction between how someone understands themselves and what they feel they need. This internal conflict often leads to avoidance, minimization of symptoms, or attempts to manage distress independently for as long as possible. At the same time, external stigma also plays a role. Despite growing awareness around mental health, cultural narratives around masculinity still often reinforce the idea that men should be self-reliant and emotionally controlled. These expectations are not always explicit, but they are deeply embedded in social environments, workplaces, peer groups, and media representation. The result is a delay in intervention, and delay has consequences. From a clinical perspective, early intervention is consistently associated with better outcomes across a range of mental health conditions. When support is delayed, symptoms are more likely to intensify, become more complex, and require more intensive intervention. In the context of men's mental health, this often means that individuals enter services at a point of crisis rather than at the onset of difficulty. This creates a pattern that is both systemic and psychological. Distress builds quietly, expression remains limited, help seeking is delayed, and intervention occurs late. By the time support is accessed, the situation is often significantly more severe than it might have been if earlier engagement had been possible. This is not a matter of individual failure. It is a reflection of how emotional learning, stigma, and service structures interact over time. Closely linked to help seeking is the issue of emotional literacy, the ability to recognize, understand, and articulate emotional states. Emotional literacy is not an innate skill. It is developed over time through experience, reflection, and language. When emotional expression is discouraged or limited, this development can be significantly disrupted. In psychological research, difficulties in identifying and describing emotions are often associated with alexithymia, a construct that describes challenges in recognizing internal emotional states. Studies suggest that alexithymic traits are more common in environments where emotional expression is restricted or undervalued. Within the context of traditional masculine socialization, this can mean that emotional experiences are felt internally but lack clear linguistic or communicative form. This has important implications for how distress is expressed. Rather than being communicated directly through emotional language, distress may appear in indirect or alternative forms. Irritability, anger, withdrawal, risk-taking behavior, overworking, or substance use can all function as secondary expressions of underlying emotional states. Importantly, these behaviors are not signs of emotional absence, but often signs of emotional displacement. However, because these expressions do not always align with culturally expected forms of emotional communication, they are frequently misunderstood. Anger may be interpreted as aggression rather than distress. Withdrawal may be interpreted as disinterest rather than overwhelm. Silence may be interpreted as emotional stability rather than emotional disconnection. This creates a gap between experience and interpretation. The individual may be experiencing significant internal distress, while those around them may not recognize the severity of what is happening. This gap can delay support, reduce relational understanding, and contribute to further isolation. Within relationships, this becomes particularly significant. Emotional communication is not only about expressing what is felt, but about being understood in that expression. When emotional language is limited, the ability to be understood is also limited. This can lead to frustration on both sides. The individual experiencing distress may feel unseen or misunderstood, while others may feel uncertain about how to respond or interpret behavior. Research in emotional communication suggests that articulation of emotional experience is closely linked to relational support and psychological well-being. When individuals are able to label and express emotions clearly, they are more likely to receive appropriate support and less likely to experience escalating distress. However, when emotional vocabulary is limited, this process becomes more difficult. This is why emotional literacy is not simply a personal skill, it is a protective factor. It shapes how distress is communicated, how it is received, and whether it is recognized in time. Ultimately, the challenge within men's mental health is not the absence of emotion, but often the absence of language and permission to express it. When we begin to place men's mental health within the context of relationships, whether romantic, familial, or friendships, a more complex picture starts to emerge because mental health is rarely experienced in isolation. It is usually observed, interpreted, and responded to through interaction with others, and in that space between internal experience and external perception, misunderstandings can easily form. One of the most common patterns in men's mental health within relationships is the misinterpretation of emotional expression. As we've already explored, emotional socialization often limits the language available for expressing vulnerability. As a result, distress may not appear in ways that are as easily recognized as sadness, fear, or emotional pain. Instead, it may emerge through withdrawal, irritability, silence, or emotional shutdown. Within relationships, these expressions can be difficult to interpret. A partner, friend, or family member may experience withdrawal as disinterest, irritability as hostility, or silence as emotional distance. However, psychological research suggests that these behaviors are often secondary expressions of internal distress rather than indicators of emotional absence. In other words, the emotion is still present, it is just being communicated through a different channel. This is where relational tension often develops, because when emotional needs are not expressed directly, they are more difficult to respond to, and when they are not recognized, both individuals in the relationship can begin to feel disconnected, one feeling unseen in their distress, and the other feeling shut out or confused by the lack of communication. This dynamic can be understood through the lens of emotional inhibition, which research by John and Gross has linked to increased relational strain over time. When emotional expression is consistently suppressed, it does not reduce emotional experience. Instead, it often increases internal pressure while reducing external clarity. In relationships, this can lead to cycles of misunderstanding where neither person feels fully understood, even when both are trying to engage. At the same time, societal expectations around masculinity can further complicate relational dynamics. The cultural expectation that men should remain composed, resilient, or emotionally contained can discourage vulnerability, even in close relationships. This means that even in safe or supportive environments, emotional disclosure may feel difficult or unnatural. Over time, this can create emotional distance not because of lack of care, but because of a lack of accessible emotional language. And that distinction is important, because emotional disconnection is often not a reflection of relational failure, but of emotional restriction. One of the most important and often misunderstood aspects of men's mental health is the way distress can escalate when it is not expressed or processed early. When emotional communication is limited, internal experiences do not disappear, they accumulate. And when they reach a certain threshold, they often emerge in more visible or intensified forms. One of the most common expressions of this is anger. Within psychological literature, anger is frequently understood as a secondary emotion, an emotion that sits on top of more vulnerable underlying states such as sadness, fear, shame, or helplessness. However, because anger is more socially acceptable within many masculine contexts than vulnerability, it often becomes the dominant outward expression of distress. This does not mean that anger is false or performative. It is real and it can be powerful, but it is also often layered over deeper emotional experiences that remain unspoken or unrecognized. In relationships, this can be particularly challenging. Because anger is highly visible, it tends to dominate interpretation. It can lead to escalation, conflict, or withdrawal from others who may feel uncertain or unsafe in responding to it. However, beneath that visibility, there may be emotional states that are far more vulnerable and less accessible. Feelings of overwhelm, inadequacy, fear of failure, or emotional exhaustion. Research into emotional regulation suggests that when individuals are unable to process emotions early, they are more likely to experience emotional flooding, a state in which emotional intensity becomes difficult to regulate or articulate. In this state, communication becomes less reflective and more reactive, which can further complicate relationships and increase misunderstanding. Alongside anger, crisis presentation is another key feature of untreated or unsupported mental health difficulties in men. Because help seeking is often delayed, individuals may only come into contact with support systems when distress has already escalated significantly. This means that mental health services, emergency care, or even family intervention often occur at a point where the situation is already acute. This pattern has been widely documented in public health research, including data from Office for National Statistics, which consistently shows that men are overrepresented in suicide statistics, particularly in working age groups. While suicide is a complex and multifactorial issue, one consistent factor identified in research is delayed help seeking and lack of early intervention. This creates a cycle that is both psychological and systemic. Emotional distress is present but unspoken. Expression is limited. Coping mechanisms are used instead of communication, and intervention only occurs at crisis point. At that stage, the emotional landscape is often more complex, more intense, and more difficult to navigate. What becomes clear across these dynamics is that men's mental health is not defined by absence of emotion, but by patterns of expression, interpretation, and timing. Distress is not missing. It is often delayed, redirected, or unrecognized until it becomes more visible. And by the time it becomes visible, it is often already at a point of escalation. As we reach the final part of this episode, it becomes necessary to move from understanding into reflection. Because while exploring the causes and patterns behind men's mental health is important, it also raises a deeper question. What now? What does this understanding ask of us, as individuals, as communities, and as a society? One of the most consistent themes throughout this episode is that men's mental health is not shaped in isolation. It is shaped by cultural expectations, emotional socialization, relational dynamics, and access to language. But while these forces are powerful, they are not fixed. They are learned, and anything learned can, in theory, be unlearned or reshaped over time. This is where the idea of responsibility becomes more complex. Because responsibility in mental health is often spoken about at an individual level, individuals are encouraged to speak up, seek help, and express emotion more openly. While these messages are important, they can sometimes overlook the structural and cultural conditions that make these actions difficult in the first place. At the same time, shifting responsibility entirely away from the individual would also be incomplete. Because change does not only happen at a systemic level, it also happens in the small, everyday decisions people make about how they relate to themselves and others. This creates a shared space of responsibility, a space where individuals, relationships, and systems all have a role to play. For individuals, this might involve beginning to recognize emotional patterns that have been learned over time and slowly building a language for experiences that may not have been previously felt expressible. For some, this may mean learning to identify emotions more precisely. For others, it may mean allowing vulnerability in relationships where it has previously been avoided. These changes are rarely immediate. They are gradual, often uncomfortable, and sometimes non-linear, but they are possible. Within relationships, this might involve creating space for emotional expression without judgment or immediate correction. It might involve learning to interpret behavior not just at surface level, but with curiosity about what might be underneath it. It may also involve recognizing that silence, anger, or withdrawal are not always what they appear to be at first glance. At a systemic level, meaningful change requires continued investment in mental health services, earlier intervention, and culturally informed approaches to care. It also requires challenging the cultural narratives around masculinity that still shape how emotional expression is understood. Reports from organizations such as World Health Organization continue to emphasize the importance of integrating mental health into broader social policy, rather than treating it as an isolated clinical issue. Ultimately, Change is not about removing struggle from the human experience. It is about creating conditions where that struggle can be expressed earlier, understood more clearly, and supported more effectively. What this episode has explored is not a lack of mental health in men, but a complexity of expression around it. We have looked at how emotional suppression is learned, how help seeking is delayed, how distress can be misread in relationships, and how anger or crisis can sometimes be the final visible point of something that has existed for much longer beneath the surface. Across all of this, one idea remains central. Men's mental health is not silent. It is often just expressed in ways that are not always recognised. And that recognition matters, because understanding is not passive. It changes how we respond, how we interpret, and how we support one another. This is not about changing men into something else. It is about expanding what is allowed to be seen, what is allowed to be said, and what is allowed to be felt without judgment. If anything in this episode has resonated with you, or if you are struggling with your mental health, support is available and you are not alone. In the UK, you can contact Samaritans at any time, 24 hours a day, by calling 116 123. They offer confidential, non-judgmental support. Mind provides information, advice, and practical support for a wide range of mental health concerns, including help with accessing services and understanding emotional well-being. For urgent support, NHS 111 can help direct you to appropriate services, and in emergencies, as always, contacting emergency services on 999 is always the safest option. It can also be helpful to remember that support does not only exist in formal settings. Talking to a trusted friend, family member, or someone you feel safe with can be an important first step. You do not need to carry everything alone.